This is your Chargers linebacker, Dan Henley, and you're tuning in with Chargers Unleashed.
Welcome to another edition of Chargers Unleashed. Jake Hefner and Dan Wolkenstein here with you from the LAFB Network. Today's show, of course, is being brought to you by BetOnline, Charger Bolt Family, and Rock Solid Sports Memorabilia. If this is your first time tuning into the show, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button on YouTube. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Dan Wolkenstein, Tuesday, May 16th. It's interesting. Just remember the excitement that we were just in just a short month ago? Not to say that there isn't reason to be excited today, but it's interesting just to see the wave of the draft just go up and up and up and up. And then after those 3 days are over, those glorious 3 days of just sitting on the couch, it just torpedoes down because now we're like in the droll part of the season where there's not much football news going on. Everybody's just waiting till training camp. I know we had the schedule released, just last week, and that got a lot of people hyped up. But it's like, oh God, what are we supposed to do?
Now everybody's talking about like the spirals being thrown on social media, and everyone's talking about like the dark blue helmets for the Chargers.
Oh yeah,
that's going to be a sign. Like everyone's searching for something.
Mm-hmm.
But here we are.
This is what no football does to people in the off season, and it can be embarrassing sometimes, to be perfectly honest.
Yes, but Jake Hefner, how are you, my friend?
I'm doing fine, man. I'm doing fine. I'm actually really excited to talk about this subject matter because specifically highlighting around the defensive line. And as we have talked about all offseason, even going to the back part of last season, defensive line was a position of high scrutiny for the Chargers with their run defense and some other things. Obviously, there's been a lot of turnaround in that unit over the last year. So there's a lot to talk about. And I'm really excited to break this all down because there's been a lot of change, but also change brings opportunity to different players and new players with this Chargers team. So I'm excited to get into this. This is going to be a fun conversation.
This is a lot of chess and checkers being played here by the Chargers front office when it comes to roster construction on the interior defensive line. And when you look at year over year, the changes, I don't think people have necessarily focused on how much difference there is. So this is going to be a fun episode. I can't wait. Going to be interesting to kind of see the comments. For folks who are listening, watching, let us know in the comments, what are you most looking forward to from an interior defensive line perspective? What is going to be the biggest change that we're going to see year over year? Jake, before we get into all of that, got to pay the bills. Over or under? How many sacks combined for the interior defensive line position in 2023?
See, as I was leading off this show talking about what the offseason does to people, Dan comes out with, again, this is May 16th, people, and Dan Wolkenstein is trying to hit me with an over-under of how many sacks the interior defensive line is going to have in the 2023 NFL season.
I'm going to put the
this
number.
This is the type of things that people are thinking about right now. This is what a football droll and just time away from football does to people.
So I'm going to give you the over-under. I'll give you the over-under at, let's see, interior total. I'm going to go over-under 14 and a half sacks.
Under. I would love for it to be more than that. It'd be great for the pass rush of this team, but it's May 16th. I am not pushing that in the over today. Sorry, sir. But
I'm going to go the over on this.
But I'll tell you what I will do, Dan. I will talk to you and I will talk to everybody else about the number one source for all of your sports wagering info. That is BetOnline. Always the fastest and easiest way to bet on all of your favorite sports, which includes live betting options and your favorite casino and card games available to play right from your very own home. All you need to do is head on over to betonline.ag to use your mobile device to join and receive your 50% welcome bonus with your first deposit. Just use that promo code BELIEVE. That's BLEAV to receive your rewards. BetOnline, where the game starts.
Interior defensive line, Jake, lots of change. We saw lots of change happening literally in season last year. Then you fast forward, Morgan Fox resigns. Hallelujah. You see Chargers go for a couple additions and subtractions in the offseason as well at the draft and free agency. This is a very different crew. Austin Johnson's coming back healthy. Uchita's coming back healthy. Sebastian Joseph Day is still here. Got Scott Matlock now in the fold. Like, it's going to look different. It's going to look different. The underbelly is drastically changed. Do you see a change for the better to start it off?
That's an interesting question to say change for the better. You look at some of this, and a lot of people would immediately go to the release of Tillery midseason last year. I think a lot of people took that as addition by subtraction in that circumstance. It just clearly was not working out with Jerry Tillery in this team. And then what ultimately ended up leading up to that is that got Fehoko to get more playing time in this defensive line, which was for the better for the team. It really was. And unfortunately, he is no longer with this team. He was signed by the Pittsburgh Steelers as a free agent. The Chargers opted not to sign him back. But Dan, you go through this and you look at this, and this is kind of why I'm interested in some of the quotes that Sebastian Joseph Day made yesterday during his press conference, because he was talking about this defensive line playing with cohesion and a camaraderie between this group. And there's a lot of new faces on this group. So that's why I was very interested in this comment, because you look at the guys along the defensive line that are no longer here. Christian Covington, signed by Detroit. Mentioned Fehoko, signed by Pittsburgh. Joe Gaziano was signed by Atlanta. Jerry Tillery, obviously he's still back with the Raiders, released in the middle of last year. And Forrest Merrill just yesterday, who was a particular favorite of mine, just signed with the Seattle Seahawks.
Was that 5 guys?
That's 5 guys that the Chargers had as part of this defensive unit last year. That not all of them received the same amount of play time, but still 5 guys in one position that you do not have. And so there has been a legitimate over the last, if you want to say the last 2 years, a lot of turnover with this group. So what you currently have on your roster right now is Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Morgan Fox, Tito, 6th-round pick Scott Matlock, Gerard Clark, who's your undrafted free agent. And let's not forget, you still have David Moa and Chris Hinton, who both of those guys got playing time late in the season last year. And a lot of people were actually impressed with the limited amount of snaps that they were able to put in. So if you want to talk about early camp battles, this is going to be a position to watch, because the Chargers are going to be able to keep all these guys. I'd be interested to see how many they end up keeping on the final 53 in general. But this is a position of huge turnover and obviously a lot of scrutiny given the way that the Chargers defended the run last year. But, I mean, just as a whole, Dan, I don't know if you could say that it's, as of now, a change for the better.
This is it's tough. I think it is personally changed for the better. When you see what the Chargers were able to do in the draft, Scott Matlock, everyone is praising for that being kind of the steal of draft. People talk about McFadden being kind of the Jamari Salyer of last year. I don't think we're going to see as much McFadden as we did Salyer this year. Prayers. But Scott Matlock, absolutely. Folks are talking about him possibly taking starting snaps. And again, this is a rotational type defense, so probably not going to do that unless you see crazy injuries. But you've got folks from Sports Illustrated, Rick Serteller from NFL Draft Bibles talk about it. Chad Reuter talks about Scott Matlock as like possibility of like taking meaningful snaps away by week 1. So you add Morgan Fox, Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, Scott Matlock, and Tito. Those 5. If we saw what Tito started to do at the end of the season before he got injured, he was really starting to come on. Brandon Staley talked about at length how he was disappointed that was when he got hurt, because he's really starting to click. Those 4 plus Matlock as a rotation, again, Fox, Matlock, Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, like, I think that's pretty good. I think it's pretty good. So I think it's better. And I think it's the one piece that I think is different to me is kind of the archetype that they're after. You look at kind of the Jerry Tillery archetype, doesn't really fit this Chargers defense. This one now, it's beefy. You go down the line of all those guys. Morgan Fox is probably the least quote unquote beefy, but even he is kind of like a big tweener. The rest of those guys, Scott Matlock, Sebastian Joseph Day, Austin Johnson, like they're huge. Tito, these guys are big. And I think from like kind of the 1.5 gap scheme that they need to kind of fill, you can see what they're after. Now, again, it takes a village. It's not just the interior to get a pass rush. It's not just the interior to stop the run. It takes everyone, which, again, Sebastian just talks about that in his press conference, which we'll talk about in a bit. But I think it's better. And I think it's designed specifically now to get interior pressure and to stop the run. Whereas I think before, it may have been less about, I mean, obviously that was important, but I feel like there was more emphasis in the previous regime of like, can we get pass rush from the interior, which I think is important. But I think right now that I think it's more like, guys, we got to stop this run, man. Like, we can't do this.
Yeah, Dan, I'm glad you brought that up because I wanted just to clarify on something on why I was saying maybe it's too early to get those expectations to think about, is it better at this point in time? Because you look at the top 4 guys that are still remaining with this team in Day, Johnson, Fox, and Tito, and all 4 of them contributing early last season. Unfortunately, the run defense was still bad. So we're not necessarily talking about a position that all of a sudden the run defense started to go bad once guys started to go down. It was a consistent problem with this team the all the way through. But I think what I'm coming around to, and I'm glad you brought up the point, and I thought you brought up a great point with the shift in the guys that they have inserted into this lineup. So, you use the Scott Matlock example. Obviously, you use the Gerard Clark example. There has definitely been a shift from Tom Telesco from when he first was the GM of this team, because if you go back and you start remembering what this defensive looked like back in the 2013 days, it was extremely different. He was trying to build it out the way that he was when he was the GM there of Indianapolis, and he liked his defensive guys small. If we all remember the days of Brandon Mebane, all those days of those guys being on this interior defensive line, he tried to build it very similar to that, where it was more of just smaller, stocky type guys that was built in Indy. And over the last couple of years, that has definitely transitioned. So bringing in a guy like Gerard Clark, going after him in undrafted free agency at his size at 335, Scott Matlock, obviously the Chargers overhauling their defensive line last year, bringing in big guys in familiarity with Sebastian Joseph Day, going out and getting Austin Johnson. I still think that if you look at last year, you had a lot of new guys along that defensive line. And as much as we would all like to just sit back and expect that unit is going to operate like a well-oiled machine from day one, we just can't do that. We expected that it was going to get better at certain points last season. Unfortunately, that didn't end up happening. But you look at these guys and you look at the core that is returning, and we'll touch on some of the quotes here from Sebastian Joseph Day from his press conference here in a second. But I think in year 2, you get a lot more cohesion between this unit. You add a lot better depth behind this defensive line that you had, and I think that the Chargers have done that fairly well. This has the potential to be a better unit. I think I'm just pumping the brakes right now to say, until I see that on the field, because the good thing is it's hard to get much worse than the Chargers were from a run defense standpoint last year. I would expect the only way you could really go is up from here. It's hard to get worse. So, but let's just see how much better you can get them to be.
Yeah, and let's get into some of the quotes. So Sebastian Joseph Day kind of talked about that very thing. He was asked about kind of the run defense and the biggest difference for improvement. And he kind of touched on the fact, one, he mentioned that like it's not, everyone talks about it being the interior defensive line's fault. And while, there is blame to go around, it's not just them. I'm going to read this quote here. It's pretty lengthy, but I figured I thought there's a lot of insight here. The biggest difference is everyone being on the same page. I think us having that experience together, because now everyone knows what excitation is. I think having Eric Kendricks here as well, it's definitely going to help with the communication on things. At the end of the day, it's just coming together as a team and using those experiences, learning from last year and the mistakes that we made, because run defense is everyone. I feel like a lot of people don't really know. Some people are like, oh, it's the defensive line. It's everyone. It's really everyone, and it's a mindset. I think that having Eric back there is really going to help with the mindset, help with the communication, help with the people getting in the right spots faster by dissecting what he sees. Again, it takes a village. But Sebastian Joseph Day is highlighting, yes, responsibilities on the interior defensive line, but that cohesion takes time. The rotation takes time. The injuries hopefully should be better than they were last year, especially for that group. And then having Eric Kendricks out there as a signal caller and communication, that's what he was brought in for. So it takes a while. But when you look at these, I mean, even Scott Matlock, like you got folks, like think about that. Your 6th round pick, people are picking to start having like meaningful snaps day 1. That's big. If Tom Telesco gets a 6th round pick to do that, especially on the interior defensive line, It's a home run.
Got a 6th-round pick to get some pretty meaningful snaps last year on the offensive line. So, hey, not out of the realm of possibility. But he's absolutely right on that, Dan. I mean, it really does take more guys than just those guys up front. Obviously, you would like to see that be where the running back stops, is at that point. You don't want to see them get to the second level. But it does take a group of guys, especially when we're talking about linebackers that you get when it comes to stopping the run and getting after it in run defense, where the Chargers have, they have gone through some guys over the last couple of years, Kaiser White, Drew Tranquil, that were better just in overall coverage and where they were relying on that run defense to stop in that position. Unfortunately, they just have not had it yet. So you go out and you get a guy like Eric Kendricks, who is extremely good when it comes to his instincts against the run. And you now hope that with Kenneth Murray and obviously with going out to in selecting Dayon Henley and his coverage abilities and what he could bring to this game, hopefully you're going to revitalize that linebacking group a little bit. But all in all, to Sebastian Joseph Day's point, it does kind of take that cohesion between defensive line and linebackers to get something done in the run game. You don't like to see running backs getting to the second level every time, but it does take that type of cohesion in order to figure out what you guys want to do against opposing running backs. So I get that. I understand that. And I think that this coaching staff and this defensive unit obviously knows that they have to be better against the run this year. Again, like I said this months ago, if I was Derek Ansley, the first thing I would have done, whether it was in this rookie mini camp this past week or if it's in the upcoming OTAs and training camp, the first thing I'm doing is I'm putting together a sizzle reel of every single play that opposing offenses ripped off for 40 yards against this defense. If you really want to light a fire under somebody's ass, that would be the first thing that I would do. And it's plain and simple. You know that you need to get better at that. Sebastian Joseph Day obviously knows it. I'm sure the rest of the team knows it, and the coaches know it. So you just hope that while you think on paper right now, standing here on May 16th, that you have a plan as far as what you want to do and to get better at, ultimately you need to go out and execute it.
Yeah. Rick Saratella, NFL Draft Bible. Talk about Scott Matlock. Marked this down as one of the biggest steals of the entire draft class. Don't be surprised to see Matlock emerge as an impact 2-down player and possibly even steal starting gig. Projection: 17 games played, 9 starts, 38 tackles, 2 sacks, 5 tackles for a loss. Chad Reuter, similar sentiment. I projected the Chargers to select Matlock in advance of the draft because he's a perfect fit on the defensive line. His power and underrated quickness will earn him a spot on the field, and I expect his snap count to increase at 5 technique as the season wears on. Now, this kind of leads us, Jake, to, I think, the final question I had for you in this. It's a good problem to have, but this interior defensive line depth is crazy. Who ends up being the odd man out on this list? Because if we go down, we talked about the top guys, obviously Austin Johnson, Sebastian Joseph Day, Morgan Fox, Atito, and then they're not going to get rid of Scott Matlock. You got Gerard Clark. You got Chris Hinton. I mean, how many are going to be there, and who's the odd man out? If it's me, my betting money is probably, unfortunately, Chris Hinton's out. What say you?
Like you said, it's a good problem to have. You've had this problem at other positions before, but when it comes to a defensive unit like this that surrendered some terrible opposing rushing numbers against it last year, this is a great problem to have. I think this is in a backwards type of a way of the coaching in the front office kind of reevaluating that position in a very subtle way. Even though they went out and they got their free agent starters that they selected last year, you've invested in that defensive line over the last 2 years in Tito and obviously Scott Matlock that you're drafting this year. But Dan, I think this, like to your point, it's a great problem to have. If I was to single someone out from this group, I'd probably say David Moa would be the odd man out. I really don't see. I find it hard to believe that a player like Gerard Clark, who a lot of people deemed as a draftable player, that a lot of people felt like that he was going to get drafted before the undrafted period started for teams to select him. I don't know how you miss a guy that's 335 pounds like that. I still expect him to go out and ball. I really do. And I find as one of the bigger guys in this defensive line, if that is really truly your plan to get big bodies in that defensive line front with a rotational piece that could be Gerard Clark at 335 pounds, I have a hard time believing that he could not make an impact in some form or fashion. So I really liked the way that Chris Hinton performed very under the radar last year, especially late in the year. I'd hate to say it, but I would think that David Moa might end up being the odd man out if we were to make early projections here.
Because realistically, if you look at the defensive line in totality, you've got Chris Rumpf, Tuli Tuipulotu, Mac Bosa. That's 4 over there. And then are we thinking, what, 5 interior defensive line make the team?
I mean,
maybe 6? I doubt it, but maybe 6.
It just depends. Does Kyle Van Noy, does his possible return end up putting a chink in that whole speculation?
Like, is there even a spot for that right now?
I believe the Chargers still have 2 more. First of all, I believe the Chargers still have 2 more spots for their full 90-man roster. So, to your point, come final roster day cut, would there even be a spot for that? I'm not sure. We all thought that the Chargers would do more than going into last season with only 3 true edge rushers, and they chose not to do that. And we know what that ended up leading to. So I don't know, Dan.
It's tough.
It's hard for me to believe that the Chargers would keep more than 5 defensive linemen.
Same.
But I think given the fact of this talent that you have, it would be hard pressed for me to keep a big body like Gerard Clark would just have to absolutely nosedive training.
You'd have to suck
to make that possible. I don't see that happening. I'm very interested in watching him play. So I could definitely see the Chargers keeping 6 along with the wide receivers this year if it ended up being pushed to that.
And then going thin at linebacker then?
You could go thin at linebacker, but again, that's also a little bit of a risk considering what you know that you have there currently, what you know is behind it, and then how many DBs. This is the crappy part of building an NFL roster. And I know we would love to keep everybody. Unfortunately, that's just not in the cards. So this will be very interesting come training camp time. Dan, one last thing I wanted to point out on this. Do you think that obviously the players, and we've kind of just evaluated this one position on the roster, and you heard from Sebastian Joseph Day just talking about the loss in Jacksonville, knowing what it is that they need to get back to in terms of a run defense in general. But do you think now that with Derek Ansley at the helm, I know everybody talks about Staley having his hands in the defense and kind of just leaving the offense to do its own thing. But you have Jay Rodgers, who's your defensive line coach and your running game coordinator. You've now promoted Derek Ansley into this, and Sebastian Joseph Day had a lot of comments about him moving into that role yesterday. Do you think that is going to be maybe an underrated aspect of this defense? Because you go from Ronaldo Hill to now Derek Ansley, obviously Brandon Staley still having his hands in the defense, that we're waiting to see this defensive genius finally put what he put in with the Rams, with this Chargers team. Do you think that that's going to be one of the more underrated aspects of getting this defensive line back to where it should be?
Yeah, and I don't think it's just the defensive line. I think it's in totality. I think if you look at kind of how the things went in the offseason, like DA was a guy that they did not want to let go. And they figured out a way to keep him because they saw him as kind of a bright mind to stay in-house. And here he is. Sebastian just today talked about kind of the differences between him and Ronaldo Hill. And he had mentioned that DA specifically has a calm urgency about him that he enjoys. He says it's intense, but it's calm. He likes his mentality, brings new energy, and I think that's something that the team needs, Sebastian Joseph Day said. We need to be able to stay calm, but also have urgency to be able to do our job. Pinpoint perfection, I think, is what that is in terms of like some of the issues that the Chargers defense had last year in the most important times at the high inflection stress points. And you can isolate that on whether it's at the catch point on defense, whether it's when you're the last man on defense and a runner, splits that for 40, 50 yards, whether that's you're that close to a sack and you miss it, tackle for loss goes by the wayside. You have to be able to stay calm, but urgent. I think that is something that can resonate all three levels of this Chargers team. I do think it's going to be an important. I think it's going to be impact. I think it's going to be something that we're going to be talking about a lot this season, and that could be something that we'll be able to tangibly look at and say that's different from Ronaldo Hill impact to Derek Ansley. And I like that Sebastian Joseph Day brought that up now, because that's like a food for thought for later. Of like, okay, at those stress points, can they stay calm? Because that's when we saw this team, in all honesty, fail last year on defense. Highlighted at worst. Again, lots of factors into it, but that 27-0 lead they gave away. You can't have that happen. And again, that could be faulted to both offense and defense. But yeah, I do think DA is going to give them a big boost in mentality and vision and focus for defense in 2023.
Defensive line, one to keep an eye on as it relates to this roster as we get closer to training camp.
Excited for training camp. About to see that battle get crazy. But it'll be a fun one. We got some mean, tough and rugged football players on the defensive line across the line. I'm going to be excited. Jake Hefner, anything else you want to tell the great friends before we head out of here for the day?
No.
Cool. Okay. For Jake Hefner, you can find him at Jake D. Hefner, myself at Dan W Sports. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please, if you have not done so already, hit that like and subscribe button. Hit the comments. Let us know what your thoughts are. Feedback, always welcome. And we'll talk to you next time on Chargers Unleashed.